Hello, and thank you for joining this Dementia Care Aware YouTube video presentation. Today's topic is supporting patients seeking US citizenship. This presentation was developed with input and support of the DCA statewide Medical Legal Partnership Network, which includes the partners on the screen. My name is Gerson Sorto, and I'm a supervising attorney with Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles. My co-presenter today is Katrina Rayco, a senior attorney also with Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles. NLSLA offers free legal help throughout the County of Los Angeles, focused on legal issues impacting communities in poverty. This includes income supports, workers' rights, housing, healthcare, public benefits, and more. You can visit our website at nlsla.org if you'd like to learn more about our organization.
Hello, everyone. This is Katrina. So as far as our learning objectives for today's training, we're just hoping to help providers understand how to support their patients that have cognitive impairments as they try to go through the US citizenship application process, known as naturalization. In this case scenario, we have Mr. Petrosian. He's a 55-year-old monolingual Armenian speaker with limited reading ability and early stage dementia. At his annual visit, he and his caregiver disclose that he is applying to become a US citizen or go through the naturalization process. And they approach you, the doctor, for help with filling out an immigration form known as the USCIS N648, which they say will make the naturalization process more accessible. Immigration determinations, such as naturalization determinations. And so that's why the forms will be submitted to them. We're going to go over the N648 in the next few slides, but I don't know if you've encountered patients like these, but I'm going to try to help guide you through how to approach this type of case and some considerations as far as the N648. So there are a few barriers, obviously, to the naturalization process, as well as some opportunities. As far as barriers, obviously, there are extensive requirements to applying for a naturalization or to become a US citizen. Not only are you supposed to submit an N648 if you have some sort of cognitive impairment, but you must also submit an N400. That's the actual citizenship application or naturalization petition. Obviously, that can be daunting for older individuals or other individuals in general. It's a lot of paperwork, a lot of information needed. Also, as far as like the waiting period for green card holders, you do have to wait a couple of years, 3 or 5, before you actually apply for citizenship. And then once you submit your N400 and other related paperwork, it is taking USCIS at least a year, if not more, to process those applications, unfortunately. And then in addition to the actual application process, there are several other requirements later down the road. For example, a US civics test where you're asked, basic questions about US history from a list of several hundred. And then you're also required to demonstrate proficiency in English. This can be obviously challenging for patients with cognitive impairments, and that's why it might be helpful for them to get support from their healthcare team as far as completing this N648, which might allow them to bypass some of these requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, the N400 is the actual application for naturalization. This is something the patient completes on their own, to why they would need additional certification on the N648 from their providers. This question specifically asks the patient if they have any physical or developmental disability or mental impairment that prevents them from demonstrating their knowledge and understanding of the English language and or civics requirements for naturalization. If they mark yes here, then they must complete the N648, which needs to be signed off by their providers.
So as Katrina mentioned, right, there's several components to becoming a US citizen. We're focused particularly on mention right up to 100 questions or fewer depending on the age of the person that they might have to remember. And of those, they're going to be asked a certain subset. And then also to have the ability to read, write, and understand English. We know that patients with cognitive impairments might be older age or because of the impairment might have particular difficulties in learning new material and definitely in learning a new language. And that's where this N648 process becomes critical. And there are many components to the form. On the left side, you'll see a snapshot of the cover page for the form. It provides some instructions to the provider or the person filling it out, including as to who can fill it out. So it mentions MDs, DOs, or clinical psychologists can certify the form, even though others in the team can potentially, participate in the process. And on the right side, you'll see a breakdown of the 7 different parts of the actual form. A lot of it is pretty straightforward in terms of filling out, the certifying professional's information, and if there's a release and all that stuff. So we're not going to focus on all of it. We're going to focus primarily on parts 3 and part 4 that focus on description of the disability or impairments, and then how that impacts the patient's ability to actually participate in the process. Ethnomeds created a really good mnemonic to keep in mind as you complete the process. I think this is a really great approach to completing the N648. So the mnemonic is done, diagnosis, origin, nexus, and effect. And we'll walk through each of those in detail. So the N648, as Katrina mentioned, is being sent to USCIS, the government agency that processes all these immigration matters. The person reviewing the form is not a medical professional. They don't have medical training. They are someone who probably sees a lot of these requests in different forms and of different quality. And they're ultimately the person who will make that determination about whether the patient has a condition that warrants this extra support and accommodation. Without the provider's direct intervention and filling out of the form and intervention through the form, the immigration official would not be able to certify that the patient needs this extra help. It would not be able to determine that an accommodation is required. So this is very important and a critical role that the providers are playing. Focusing on the first aspect of the question, it's important to present all the information in very simple layperson terms. Looking at the diagnosis, the form asks, what clinical or laboratory diagnostic techniques did you use to diagnose each of the applicant's disabilities and/or impairments? And it's important, obviously, to highlight that in a comprehensive way, but referencing technical examinations or diagnostic tools that you use in coming to determination whether it's dementia or whether it's some other cognitive impairment. But to the extent you can, also explaining in layperson terms what the condition is and what those tests are. That's very important and a very critical part of this process. You'll be asked to enter information about the disabilities that the patient has, when those began, and what effect the disability has and the impairment has on the patient's ability to read English, speak English, write English, or answer questions regarding the US history or civics. So it's really important that you answer all of those based on how the patient condition impacts them. Secondly, to explain the origin of the disability and also how it's not related to drug use. The areas that USCIS has determined that even though someone might have a disability, if that disability is a result of illegal drug use, then this particular remedy will not be available for them. So if there are multiple impairments that a patient has, and maybe some are the result of drug use, those would not be good ones for the purposes of USCIS. However, if the patient has some impairments that it's very clear that they're not the result of drug use, then those might be ones that USCIS would consider in determining whether a patient might be one that qualifies for this sort of accommodation. Next, it's really important to be specific in terms of the symptoms that the patient has. If they have dementia, what are those symptoms? If they have memory issues resulting because of the dementia, does that keep the patient from remembering simple things? Like, do they not remember to take their medication, for example, or some other basic issues like that? If so, then explaining through the nexus, right, that in addition to being able to having this dementia diagnosis, the patient can't remember enough to learn a new language or can't remember enough to learn the answers to very specific US civics questions. So that's a very important component of this. And then finally, the conclusion being that the applicant cannot learn English, cannot learn the US civics test, and needs a special accommodation. There might be a patient that comes to you that says, I need you to fill out this form. And ultimately, it's up to the provider, knowing kind of what you know about what is needed, to determine whether the patient has an impairment or disability that meets that standard. There might be a patient who maybe in general finds it difficult to learn a new language. That inherent difficulty is not sufficient. There needs to be a disability and or an impairment that then that can be linked to show that yes, this patient, not only is it just difficult for them to learn a new language because they're older, it's difficult because they have a disability or an impairment that's actually keeping them from doing so. That's really important to note the ultimate effect that the impairment or disability has.
So as far as completing the N648 might need a little bit of input from both the legal side and the clinical side, obviously the clinical side. As far as nursing, social worker, case managers, they might be helpful as far as supporting the client and communicating with their providers about their need for the N648. Maybe they can also help communicate their patients' disabilities and impact to the providers, but ultimately the provider has to complete and sign off on the N648. It has to be someone with a medical degree, either MD or DO or a psychiatric degree, and they're the ones that are going to have to sign off at the end of the day. As far as the legal team, we can definitely offer feedback on the N648. For example, if a provider has a question about a particular section or they need more details on how to strengthen the nexus between the patient's impairment and their inability to complete English or civics exams. And then if needed, and the N648 is not an option, we can also counsel patients on alternative options, like maybe a reasonable accommodation request with USCIS, or maybe exploring other exemptions based on the patient's age and length of residency in the US. We listed a couple resources on this slide. Obviously, the Dementia Care Aware Network, they have a lot of great resources in addition to this training for dementia care providers. And then we also linked the instructions and the forms for the naturalization process. So the N400 that I referenced previously, as well as the N648 that we've been going over in case you wanted to preview what that looks like. We also included additional resources on disability accommodations and immigration legal resources as well as the N648. So one more detail on that on the last link there. That concludes the training for today. Thank you so much for participating and for giving us your time. If you needed more information, you can definitely contact the Dementia Care Aware Network at this email address listed here, and look forward to working with you all at some point.